Lawmakers blame Russia for the poisoning of a former double agent and his daughter, but the Prime Minister still couldn't give MPs 100% confirmation of their suspicions. Also ahead this RT News Hour, dozens of civilians, including children, managed to flee the embattled Syrian enclave of eastern Ghouta in the past 24 hours. Militants are continuing to shell those trying to escape, while others have now cut a deal to let civilians out in exchange for their own safety. And a draft report from U.S. Republicans concludes there was no election collusion between Donald Trump and Russia, but furious rival Democrats say the investigation was dishonest and not thorough. Around the clock across the world, this is RT. From the team and myself, Ewan O'Neill, welcome to the programme. Our top story. The British Prime Minister says it's, quote, highly likely that Russia is behind the poisoning of former double agent Sergei Skripal. The investigation into the poisoning of Skripal and his daughter is still ongoing. Authorities believe they were deliberately targeted with a nerve agent. Traces of the substance were detected at the restaurant where the two ate before they were found unconscious on a nearby park bench. Anastasia Turkinen looks now at the claims made by Theresa May.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
Highly likely is an interesting term to use, given that the investigation is still ongoing. There has been no evidence presented by the police. We do know that Theresa May herself has said that authorities would be given some more time to look into exactly what happened. And there seemed to be one voice, at least, inside the House of Commons. Opposition Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn called for dialogue, but that message seemed to have fallen on deaf ears.
Robust dialogue with Russia on all the issues currently dividing our countries, both domestic and international, rather than simply cutting off contact and letting the tensions and divisions get worse.
I entirely agree with the Prime Minister in her approach to this murderous attack.
We are not backing down. This is an act of terrorism, and all members of Parliament should stand together.
But while we may not be in a period of Cold War with Russia, as we were in the 1980s, because of their actions, it could be said that we are at least now entering a period of Cool War.
I have absolutely no doubt that the only way to deal with Putin's regime in Russia is robustly, decisively, and together as a parliament and a country.
Is Russia a fit and proper state to be hosting or engaging in international sporting fixtures in 2018?
We possess a considerable range of offensive cyber capabilities which we will not hesitate to deploy against that state if it is necessary to keep our country safe.
We've all agreed that Russia is a clear and present danger. We have got to be fully organised to meet that danger.
The nerve agent Novichok was developed by Russia specifically to avoid being covered by the Chemical Weapons Treaty. So could my right honourable friend today confirm firstly that Novichok is a totally illegal substance under a treaty to which Russia is signatory?
The British Prime Minister Theresa May went on to say that it will not be business as usual with Russia anymore. She said that the Russian ambassador to the UK has been summoned to answer the questions about where this nerve agent had potentially come from. Theresa May said that if there's no credible answer from Russian officials by Wednesday, that's when the UK will get back to the table to look at potential sanctions. Well, these latest moods and atmosphere in terms of future relationships with Russia don't seem too surprising given the extent of the media hype we have seen unraveling throughout this last week when it comes to this incident with Sergei Skripal. We've seen headlines saying it looks like a state-sponsored attack. Russia should be treated like a terrorist. It is. Whether the Skripal poisoning can be conclusively pinned on Moscow is beside the point. So given this extreme hype that this case has walked hand in hand with, it's not too surprising that it does not seem that the British government is going to drop that narrative, despite the fact that the investigation is yet to be finalized. Lots of developments here, certainly very, very hyped up story, yet it seems to be important to keep looking forward to what the investigation brings, and of course we'll be here watching that.
Well, Russia described the recent statements in the British Parliament as a circus, saying that it was yet another information and political campaign based on provocation. Moscow has also asked for the results of investigations into the deaths of Russian nationals on UK soil. Novichok, the nerve agent mentioned by the UK Prime Minister, is a binary gas, meaning it contains a mixture of elements. It was secretly developed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s. However, its formula is no longer confidential. It's reputed to be one of the most deadly nerve agents ever created. Former CIA officer Philip Giraldi believes that Theresa May's allegations veer away from the factual.
Well, I think what we're seeing here is she's making a political point. She essentially is responding to the media in Britain, which is going hysterical on this story. And also, I think she's hoping to hurt your president, Vladimir Putin, by making this statement shortly before the Russian elections. She also said, it appears to be. I mean, appears to be is a rather non-specific expression, which means they don't know. And I would also add that if this were a Russian military-grade nerve agent, the two people involved in this would be dead, and there would be about 100 more people dead in the immediate vicinity of this. So the whole story doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and as you say, it invites analysis that says, how would the Russians be so stupid to do something like this if they really intended to do it and keep it secret?
Well, no evidence has yet been provided of Russia's direct involvement in the poisoning of the former spy. But some news outlets are already speculating on how the UK will respond. One British newspaper lists the expulsion of diplomats, more EU sanctions, an increased NATO presence on Russia's border, as well as revoking RT's UK broadcasting licence. Others claim that the Prime Minister has even cleared the way for a cyber attack. Radio talk show host John Gaunt believes Theresa May has been pushed by her cabinet to take a tougher stance on Russia.
But it's all part of the fact that she's under incredible pressure at the moment, not only from the Labour Party, but from members of her own cabinet, not even her own party, but her cabinet. Her position is very weak, and the pressure's been growing for her to make some kind of statement that would condemn Russia. Let's find out the facts. If it is Russia, or if it is what they're calling state-sponsored terrorism, then it'll have to be dealt with. But at the moment, that hasn't been proved. And I think rather than picking a fight with Russia, maybe we should be asking Russia for their help, to help us and understand what's going on. Whereas she said, look, okay, tell us what's going on, but she's only given them a day. I just think it's rather ridiculous. And also, what will we do that can possibly damage Russia? I don't think this is a fight we want to get into at the moment.
To the Middle East now, and another story we're closely following today. Some militants occupying the Syrian enclave of eastern Ghouta have agreed to let 100 civilians out in exchange for their own safety. The Russian Reconciliation Center says the first group, some of whom are wounded, has already passed through the humanitarian corridor. Well, earlier there were reports that militants had attacked some civilians trying to reach a government-controlled area. 5 of them were killed as a result. Well, the rebel-held area of eastern Ghouta has been besieged by government forces since 2013, but fighting there has recently escalated. In the last number of days, the Syrian government has regained a large portion of the territory, essentially driving the militants into just 3 pockets. Well, with the humanitarian situation there remaining dire, the UN Security Council gathered to focus on relief efforts in eastern Ghouta. However, some members quickly descended into trading threats. The US envoy even warning that Washington is ready to attack the Syrian government.
We also warn any nation that is determined to impose its will through chemical attacks and inhuman suffering most especially the outlaw Syrian regime, the United States remains prepared to act if we must. It is not the path we prefer, but it is a path we have demonstrated we will take, and we are prepared to take it again.
In her remarks, U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley essentially used the language often used to justify U.S. military interventions, saying that the USA essentially reserves the right to attack the Syrian government. Now, the meeting was convened to discuss the situation in eastern Ghouta. This is a rebel-held enclave where there is fighting taking place. Now, when Nikki Haley got up to speak, rather than simply touching on the situation and the plight of civilians and efforts to make sure that civilians are not hurt, she actually chose to make a barrage of allegations against Russia, Iran, and Syria. And in her remarks, she went as far as saying that the three countries were actually responsible for some chlorine attacks. Now, then we heard a response from the Russian ambassador who said this is simply a disinformation campaign.
In the past 16 days, there have been 3 separate allegations of chlorine gas attacks. This is no ceasefire. This is the Assad regime, Iran, and Russia continuing to wage war against their political opponents.
We understand that the goal of this disinformation campaign is to manipulate public opinion and convince people the Syrian government is using chemical weapons. But we have reasonable concerns that there are preparations to stage fake chemical attacks in order to later accuse the Assad government. And according to our data on the 5th of March, the al-Nusra terrorists used chlorine in eastern Ghouta, injuring 30 people.
Nikki Haley said that the United States is currently in the process of putting forward a new draft resolution that would not contain what she called counterterrorism loopholes. Essentially, the current resolution for a ceasefire allows the Syrian government to continue fighting against the terrorists and extremists in eastern Ghouta. She's arguing that this new resolution put forward by the United States would not allow for the fight against terrorist groups like al-Nusra to continue. At this point, we're hearing from Moscow that these terrorists in eastern Ghouta are essentially using civilians as human shields. They are holding the civilians in the area and actually staging executions. Now, in his response to Nikki Haley, the Russian ambassador pointed out that essentially what was supposed to be a meeting about the plight of civilians in eastern Ghouta seemed to have turned into a vehicle for some unprincipled attacks on the government of Russia.
Last time I promised to count how many times the US envoy would mention Russia during her statement. I counted. It's 22.
Russian, Russia, 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 Russian, Russian, Russians, Russia, Russia, Russians, Russian, Russians, and Russia, Russians, the Russian, Russia, Russian, Russia, and the Russians.
It's done for political purposes only and not out of care for civilians.
Everyone in the UN Security Council seems to be in full agreement that the lives of civilians in eastern Ghouta should be protected. However, there are some pretty strong disagreements about how that should be carried out and how and who is responsible for the situation there. And we've heard some rather extreme rhetoric in the 15-member body that leads the United Nations.
Well, there is also ongoing violence in Syria's northern city of Afrin, where Turkey is carrying out a military operation against Kurdish groups it considers to be terrorist. While the situation there wasn't thoroughly discussed at the United Nations, a crowd of pro-Kurdish protesters turned out in London, with police forced to intervene as the rally became increasingly agitated. Around 150 protesters marched near Parliament to Westminster Bridge, where they clashed with police. The demonstrators demanded an end to British weapons sales to Turkey and called on the international community to speak out against Turkish actions in Afrin. Ankara's Operation Olive Branch began in January and has caused thousands of casualties, mostly among Kurds. The Israeli military is facing a public backlash after removing an online video to mark International Women's Day last week. It features female soldiers working in various roles in the Air Force, but the commentary includes sexist remarks attributed to religious leaders about women in combat. The video was taken down after alleged pressure from religious groups.
הם אומרים, נשים לא יכולות להיות לוחמות. נשים לא בנויות בשביל זה. הן פשוט לא יכולות פיזיולוגית. נשים צריכות להיות בבית עם הילדים. מתעמרים.
Israel Defense Forces in